In this episode, I'm going to take a look at new features in QGIS 3.10. Okay, this episode will cover a lot of new features from the 3.10 release. And when I record this, it isn't officially released yet. So some minor details may not be exactly as I present it, but it should be pretty much dead on. There will be an official visual change log. I'm going to use another one to exemplify some of the new features, but there's a lot of them. There's a lot of new features. So I will not be able to go through all of them, but I'll try to cover as many as possible, and at least the ones I feel familiar with. And we better get started because this is going to be a lot to take care of. And I have tried to organize it in a flow that is coherent, but I may need to jump around a bit. So I have a document that I will try to cover from start to finish. And the first thing is the redesigned landing page when you start QGIS. We have recent projects as before. There is also project templates if you have any saved. There will be a new empty project template as a default. And there will also be a news section if there are any news, and they are hidden. Let's see if I can find it here in this area. So when there are official news from the project or in your local language, that will be displayed here. So don't worry if you don't see any news. It's just because there aren't any right now. Okay, let's see. Some changes in the settings. In map tools, they have added some units for preferred angle units. So now you can specify milliradians and mils. That is a military unit for angles. So that is one of the possibilities. Another settings is when you do interface customizations. You can now search for the object you want to use. So save like that. It will make it a bit easier if you customize your interface, but I'm not going to do that. I will probably fast forward some during this video, so you don't have to sit and wait for me to find stuff. This is probably one of those times. There it is. For rasters, this is great. I always, almost always, when I have discrete data, specify the resampling to bilinear and average. That, to me, makes discrete raster data look so much nicer. Test. I just copied the project to a new location, which means it doesn't find the data anymore. But if you, as you see here, there are similar paths to the data. So now when you update one and apply changes, I think it did this before, but now it's the process is improved on in the way that it tries to find and apply the changes to other data. And another improvement, spatial bookmarks is now available in the browser. So now I will open another project. Yeah, so in QGIS 3.10 you now have the spatial bookmarks in your browser, for instance. So I only have 2 here, but you can right click it and zoom to bookmark, or you can double click them or drag them onto the canvas. The spatial bookmarks can also be used when you're working with layouts. Let's see, new layout, add a map, and let's see where we have it. Here, I can select what spatial bookmark should be in this area, so like that. There are more new features around spatial bookmarks, but I think I'll get back to those a bit later. If you have a layer here or a project, you can extract symbols from the context menu. So just right click the project file and extract symbols, and you will get all the symbols in a style manager database like this. Here you can select styles and copy them directly to your default style database. I'm not going to do that with those right now. Anyway, and you also see here a few new tabs. So text format and label settings are also now possible to save in the style manager. When it comes to styles, there's also a few new algorithms to combine several style databases and create style database from project, more or less the thing we did here by right click. But this means that you can build and create databases in a model and save them to a new style database. Or you can create a Python script that goes through an entire directory to search for project files and extract the styling. Let's see here, where are we? Yeah, some new format support. So for instance, zipped shape files or chisel files, I don't know what they're supposed to be called, SHZ files, will be supported when there is GDAL 3.1 support for QGIS. So some of the new features are depending on other libraries. So for instance, in my Linux distribution, I only have GDAL 2.4.2, and the current Windows version is 2.4.1. So you need at least 3.1 to handle the zipped shapefiles. And it is really depending on a lot of other stuff. For instance, the GRASS libraries are in need of updating before you will see GDAL 3 in your QGIS installation. There are some distributions for Linux that do use 3.0 at least, and the nightly builds for Windows are using 3.1. So if you really are interested in some features that require GDAL 3, you are, for now you really need to use the nightly builds or specific Linux distributions. Otherwise, it's just wait, and sooner or later there will be updated GDAL libraries and thus new functions in QGIS. There's now support for OAuth verification in Oracle databases. There's some improved raster support in PostGIS. I'm not sure exactly to what extent, but there are some improvements. If you are using Oracle, now it's also possible to manage transactions within QGIS. If you are using delimited text, it's now possible to have coordinates in Z and M dimensions as well. So in the import dialog, you can specify fields for Z and M as well. This is a line with Z values. And when I use identify tool on that, it will give me Cartesian 2D, Cartesian 3D, and ellipsoidal distance length. So now you get the 3D length for line strings with Z values. So it's now possible also to add markers and hashes for hashed lines on central points on each segment. That's one thing that is new. Let's say you have done a lot of selections of your polygons, like this, and then by mistake you deselect everything. It is now possible to go to the selection menu and reselect features. If you use a graduated renderer, let's see what we can create. It's now possible. Oh, look, really nice icons here. The new thing is logarithmic scale. So now you can divide your features by a logarithmic scale. Let's see if we add a label. Not sure it works on polygons, but if you go to the label properties in the label toolbar, you now have the option to control the multi-line alignment for lines. I need to make this a multi-line first. So for this feature, I could make it center. I'm not sure you will see that. And for this feature, I could make it right aligned. Another new feature in this toolbar is the unplaced labels. I'm not sure I will have any unplaced labels until I zoom out. So any unplaced labels are shown in red. And that means that, for instance, you can move them. And thereby placing them. But if you move them, you may be unsure to what object they are connected. Then you can add callouts like this. And that's a normal line style, so you can create any type of line you want. And there's a few options for the types of lines, simple lines or Manhattan lines. Yeah. When you are doing texts, you sometimes want a background. And now it's also possible to use marker symbols as backgrounds. And that opens up a whole new area of what is possible to have as a background for your text labels. You can set overrun feature to a value. So when you move away, maybe this was a bad, but here it sticks out a bit at least. If we increase it even further, the text is, it's possible to have the text displayed even if the lines are shorter. And you can specify by how much in the placement settings for the labels. Overrun feature. Label every part of multipart features. That is now possible to do a data-defined override for. You now also can show vertical labels. Vertical. It's really not that useful for me with this type of text, but there are languages that write this way, and now it's possible to use vertical text orientation. When you render the canvas, let's see, export to PDF, for instance, you now have the option to add georeferenced information. And that works for rasters like TIFF or PDFs that will be embedded in the files. So that will be a geospatial PDF. However, GeoPDFs, that is another new feature that will have to wait until you have GDAL version 3.0 or later. That will also enable layered PDFs in your exports. So when you create map PDFs from the layout, you can then create those as layers. I haven't tested that because I'm also waiting for GDAL version 3. There's a new text decoration. So if you go to View and Decorations, now you can add an image. So by enabling image, maybe set some transparency to the color for this SVG, that is default. and show it bottom left with some margin. Now you can have an image as a decoration in your canvas. And it will be in the lower left corner every time the map re-renders. Okay, so here I have a simple polygon layer, and if I go to 3D symbology, I can set it as a single symbol. Oh, I'm in the wrong layer. Here, I already have a symbology. It's extruded 10 meters. Don't try this with unprojected data. It will be bad. So make sure you have projected data when you try this in 3D. And let's open a 3D viewer. One of the new things in 3D is the visual, what is it called? On-screen navigation. So you can use buttons and dials, move around, etc. if you feel a bit uncomfortable with the mouse. Actually, I find it quite confusing, this navigation in 3D. The orbiting, when you press on the middle button or the scroll wheel, you can orbit, but the way you orbit doesn't quite work as other 3D software. It's a bit weird, at least to me. Another thing is that to pan you use the left mouse button, and to rotate you use the scroll wheel to push down on. If you go to a normal map, you pan with the left mouse button if you have the pan tool selected. But more often I have some other tool selected, and then I use the scroll wheel to push on to pan. So to me it would have been better to pan pushing down on the scroll wheel and orbit pushing on the left mouse button. Now it's the opposite. So a bit confusing, at least to me. But we'll see. 3D is still young in QGIS, so it is developing. Another new thing is 3D measurement. So, okay, there we go. If you want to measure the distance from this facade of this building to this facade, now you can click on the facades, and that will create a line between them. That is actually in 3D. Okay, let's see, what else do we have? Yeah, we have a new point marker that I actually haven't gotten to work really good. So for single symbols, you now have the possibility to use a billboard. And that's just any marker. And I think this is a bit confusing, because if I make this 500 meters, this is clearly not 500 meters. Millimeters, points, meters at scale. Well, let's just pick something that looks okay size-wise. There we go. Let's make it 100. Then I want it displayed on top of this. Then I need to change the billboard height. But no matter what value I put in, it's still there. So if I change it to terrain, still there. Absolute, still there. So I'm not quite sure how this is supposed to be done. The symbol, the billboard symbol, is supposed to hover above the object, but I haven't quite gotten that to work. There's quite a few improvements in the layout. Add a frame. If I add a legend, I now have the possibility to change the alignment. Let's see where we do have that. So for item labels, I could align them to the right, for instance. So combinations of this is now possible in 3.10. More options for margins. So you can modify your legends to a greater extent than before. Text for scale bars is now also possible to do data-defined overrides for. Let's make it... yeah, and you could previously do ticks down, for instance, like this, but you couldn't place the labels below. Now you can. So let's see, where do we have vertical label placement below segment, like that. And you can also choose not to have the labels at the segment ends. You can put it at the center of the segments, like that. Yeah, here we go. The font settings for labels. Now you can do data-defined overrides for them. So, for instance, I can change the style. So, if the scale value is 100, then I want it to be bold. Otherwise, just leave it. And now it's bold. So this make it possible to do some additional stuff with your scale bars. Another new thing, when you export to PDF or SVG, you now have the option to simplify the geometries. And if you have a map with a really complex vector geometry, this will really reduce the file size. So it's on by default. but you can turn it off if you find some problems with your exports. And it works for PDFs and it works for SVGs. But as I mentioned before, you need GDAL 3 or later in order to make the GeoPDFs with the layered PDFs. So grids. Now you have some data-defined overrides for grids. Important to note is that the grid is one object, so it will not be possible to make the grid look different by itself. So you have thick lines to the right and thin lines to the left, for instance, or stuff like that. The data-defined overrides define the single object, the grid. So there is that. However, it makes it possible to have a new type of grid. So instead of defining the interval as map units, you can define it as fit segment width. And then you tell it the intervals should be between 10 millimeters and 50 millimeters, for instance. Let's add some coordinates. Yeah, decimal fine. Remove the decimals. That will create a grid that is between those values. So if I zoom, you will see that the values, the interval between the values change, which is useful if you have a template that you want to be able to use in different scales and you want a grid. To look out for is that it's right now it's 100 meters interval. That will change. So right now it's 70 meters in interval. But depending on what you type in the interval settings, it will try to find the prettiest interval. Let's jump back to the canvas. Okay, I need to add my GPS information panel. If you are using QGIS to digitize, you can now set the timestamp. Some more additional properties for the timestamps for the GPS data. There are a few new buttons in the raster calculator. Absolute, minimum and maximum. That was a request from the users and it's now implemented. There's a new algorithm called create layer from point. So if you pick a point, you can create a layer from that. That can also be used in processing. Any GDAL processing tools, let's just pick one, now have additional properties. So you can always add settings to a GDAL command manually if it is missing. A lot of these commands are a bit complex and the GUI for it doesn't always expose all the possible choices. But now you can add any extra commands manually for all GDAL processing tools. When you're building models, let's just add an extent here. You can mark them as advanced. Let's not use extent, do something simpler. Vector layer, make it normal, and then we use a buffer. Okay, if we run this, we see the point layer. But I may want to add a number here. Distance. A default number as 50. Make it advanced. And make the distance like that. And if I run this, I now have an advanced parameters set. So it has a default value, and I can change it, but I tell the users that this is the advanced parameters. If you have a need for input in colors, you can do that in your models now. For files, you can now add filters, file filters, or make it a folder type. If you are creating tiles, these tools now run multi-threaded. So it will hopefully run a lot faster if you have a machine with several CPU threads. There's a new tool that's called Climb Along Line. So for instance, if we go to this line here, that's a line with Z values, and I want to have some form of indication on the climbs and the descents for this line. I can run this tool, and then I get a table with climb distance, descent distance, minimum and maximum elevations. That could certainly be useful for trail mapping, as long as you have Z values for your line features. The create grid process is now completely written in C++, so it will also be a lot faster, hopefully. So if you are generating complex grids over huge areas, this will be a significant improvement. That's the last row in my notes, but I have skipped a few rows simply because I couldn't find the feature quickly right here. There are, as I mentioned before, a lot of new features. So when the 3.10 is officially released, there will be a visual change log, more or less like this, hopefully a few more images. And you can go through all the new features that are available in 3.10. And again, bear in mind that some really useful features like layered PDFs will not be available for you until your operating system or your depending libraries are upgraded or updated. So don't be disappointed if you can't produce layered PDFs just yet, and don't be disappointed if you can't edit zipped shapefiles. It will come eventually. So hopefully I was able to edit this video so it wasn't too rambly and made a lot of nonsense, and you got at least some impressions of new features in QGIS 3.10. See you next time.